My name is Anica Mićić. I'm a food student here at the Academy. And for my thesis, the subject of my interest was the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Louder.
Okay, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the upsurge of performance anxiety in adolescent music performance students. And of course, all of that couldn't be done without my mentor, Dr. Katarina Habe. So I'm utmost grateful for all the insight. And before anything, I will just present you the general agenda of how this defense will partake. So I will just tell you a couple of things about my research. What is my research about? Why did I decide to write about what I wrote? And the next one will be a theoretical background that will be needed for understanding of the practical, aka the empirical part, which was an actual research I conducted myself. And the end will be a full-on discussion where anyone could ask their questions, and everything is more than welcome. So, in the very introduction, what was this work about? Why did I decide to write what I wrote? So my idea was to gain a better understanding of how musicians were coping with a global crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, and how did that affect their mental well-being and their mental health in general. And most importantly, how did that change their relationship to the stage, to performance, to their instruments, to this profession. And in the end of it all, I analyzed different aspects apart from just COVID, such as effects of social reintegration after the period of the COVID pandemic, as well as changes of everyday regimes after the pandemic, and just the globalization and digitalization of classical music. What were their opinions and what did they have to say on that? And why did I decide to research this? Simply because I wanted to bring more awareness on the topic of students' mental health and generally in these waters, in the waters of academia. So, to start out the theoretical background, I decided to say a little bit more about what MPA, aka Music Performance Anxiety for short, is. I wanted to give the reader or the listener the general knowledge about the topic so they can tackle the research I conducted afterwards. And that's how my work is split in two main parts. First is the theory part, and then it's the research. And so, the first thing I spoke about was the phenomenology of music performance anxiety, or MPA as I will refer to it now. So what is music performance anxiety? It is nothing more but an umbrella term for different disorders that have something to do with the fear of performance and the fear of being perceived publicly and judged by others. And so in literature, we don't see a coherent term for it. There is still no agreement on how to call it in literature. So we can see terms such as stage fright, pre-performance thrill, music performers stress syndrome, or musical performance anxiety are just some of those. And depending on the name, that's a different variable of MPA. So for example, pre-performance thrill doesn't have to be negative at all. It is something that's needed for a good performance. Whereas MPA is something that can be destructive to a person experiencing it on stage because it's completely incapacitating. You feel like all that you know is completely lost in that moment when you're being judged and perceived. So that's shortly what MPA is. And how does MPA develop in something? So now we have the question of nurture versus nature. Is it something genetical? Is it a case of an autosomal gene where if a parent has it, you have 50% chances of getting it? Or is it something that's developed all throughout your lifetime? I mean, regarding on how were you raised as a kid, how did your parents treat you, how did your teachers treat you, how did you develop the relationship with the stage? So what is it? Technically, it's neither one or the other. It's both of them. It's not fully genetical, so there is no evidence that shows that it's fully genetical. Some people argue that some collections of DNA on the chromosomes when met with the right outside stimuli, can be activated, which means that all of us could have the predisposition. It just hasn't been turned on yet by the right negative stimuli from the environment. And so on. There is a theory that describes it very well. It's Barlow's triple vulnerability theory, in which he describes how anxiety, or just in general mood disorders, are developed. And so here Diana Kenny, she is an Australian researcher, and she did a lot for the field of music performance anxiety. And in her 2006 research, she talks about comparing Barlow's theory of developing mood disorders with MPA, and it's very similar, I would say. So the triple vulnerability theory is based off of 3 vulnerabilities. The first one is a general biological vulnerability. Also, I'll refer to it as trait anxiety. So something as a predisposition, something genetical, something inheritable. The second one is a general psychological vulnerability, which is just activated by the outside, meaning it's environmental. And the third one is a specific psychological vulnerability. So this is just a bunch of words. I will just put it in perspective for you by showing an example. So let's say we have a student, his name is Michael, and he just finished elementary school going into middle school. This is important because music performance anxiety does not pick age. It can happen literally whenever his son is like. But most of the research tells us that it happens in those transitional periods where our cognition is being increased, so we're more aware that we have a chance of public scrutiny. And Michael is going from elementary to middle school, so a transitional period of his life. He's a good student, he has straight A's, he's very polite, and he also plays violin on the side. So he's brought from a music family, and he started playing when he was 4. So there was always this talk, this narrative that he's supposed to do music for his life. There was no peer pressure, but he knew sort of it was expected of him to do music. He also has a teacher who's very ambitious, who wants him to succeed in life and do so well at all the competitions that he wants to go to. And so they compete a lot, he's perceived a lot. But the teacher does not give him the set of rules, the skill set, nor the tools to reach the greatness he acquires from him. Meaning that Michael now has second vulnerability, general psychological vulnerability. And I hadn't mentioned, but Michael in this case is also high in trait anxiety, meaning that he only needs one more aspect to develop music performance anxiety. And as of lately, Michael had his last performance, his most recent one, where his palms were extra sweaty and his knees and his lips were trembling, and he did not know what was going on with him. So his heart rate just started pumping up, and he realized that his extremities are getting really cold. What was going on with Michael is that he entered fight or flight stage, where he felt in danger for his own life on the stage, which is important. So all of his bloodstream went into his vital organs, such as his lungs and his heart, to keep him alive, because Michael felt that his life was in danger in that moment. Little did he know, those were the first signs of music performance anxiety, and later on, Michael met the third vulnerability, meaning that he has full predisposition to be diagnosed with MPA. So in theory, that's how it works. And after all of that, Michael is met with a global pandemic where he doesn't know how to cope with this newfound diagnosis of his. And so that's what I wanted to do with my research. I wanted to hear those Michaels. We probably have them in our classes. We have them everywhere around us. Maybe we are one of them. I wanted to give those people a voice in my research and see their opinions. After this, we have the epidemiology of NPA in diagnostic aspects. In the epidemiology, I just did a review of some researches, and what we found out is that mostly it's predominant in females, but that does not follow when it comes to children. So in children, it's the exact same. Nor males nor females have a predisposition to develop it. And when it comes to the way it manifests the exact same. In most research, it shows in children and in adults, which means that adults and children experience that fear in the exact same way. Next one is the diagnostic criteria. So since we don't have a definition of MPA, since there are so many terms that are used for it, and there is no general consensus on how do we want to call it, it is not a part of the DSM-5, meaning the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders does not involve it into the book. So nor in the 2022 rendition or the 2013 rendition has recognized MPA as a real diagnosis, as a disorder. So we cannot really diagnose it that easily because it falls under the category of social phobias. And if the kid does not portray symptoms of social phobias, it's very difficult to diagnose them with MPA. And so Diana Kelly, in her 2023 research, has found her own way of diagnosing people with music performance anxiety called the KMPAI method. And that's essentially K means Kenny, a music performance anxiety inventory. And it's a 40-step inventory based off of a 7 Likert scale. And it is recognized in 400 works so far and translated into 22 languages. So technically, it's a positive discourse for diagnosing people. More and more people in recognizing MPA in more people. Lastly, we have treatment for MPA. When it comes to treatment options, we have psychological and pharmacological, of course. And the psychological ones, the most prominent one is CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. But in research, it is not shown that it can fully relieve you of MPA symptoms. So it is best if it's performed with other alternative therapies such as hypnotherapy, then Alexander technique, then biofeedback, and so on. When it comes to pharmacological, there's not a lot of research that's newly written due to the ethical question of it all. So most of the research is from the 60s or the 70s. And we have two main things here. We have beta blockers and we have anxiolytics, SSRIs, antidepressants. Prozac and Zoloft are the most common ones. And people prefer to go, people who have somatic symptoms of MPA prefer to go for beta blockers because their mental alertness is still there. When they take anxiolytics, it's not the same question, it's the same thing. And then, depending on what they're trying to calm down, if someone has a shaky go, for example, propranolol has shown great results, or nadolol has not, and there are two types of beta blockers. So, depending on what you want to solve, there's different medication to go for. Then, I just tackled a little bit of general information about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it affected the general society, and most importantly, how it affected students. And so, as we all know, COVID-19, there was an outburst. Social Health, Global Health Organization proclaimed it on the 11th of March, 2020. And it officially ended on the 3rd of May, 2023. And so what I'm interested here about is hearing how did it affect people? How did it affect the people who were most vulnerable here? So the most vulnerable here were, of course, health workers, elderly people, then children, minorities, people from rural communities, and students. And so it's noticed that the people who already struggled with some type of mood disorder essentially just felt an increase in the symptoms of that very disorder, especially depression, anxiety, paranoia, and OCD-related struggles, as well as substance misuse. And when it comes to the students and how did they feel the impact of the COVID, I will compare it in the first wave. I will compare the first wave to the second wave. So in the first wave of the pandemic, there was a big upsurge in anxiety, depression, and eating disorders among adolescents. And in the second wave, there was a lot more suicidal behaviors, and nationwide, a lot of countries all over the world have spoken about the issue. And what it comes down is to the uncertainty of the whole situation, and its uncertainty about exam periods for students especially, and uncertainty about how are we gonna access technology, how are we gonna access classes that are online, and so on. A lot of people were worried about their family's income, or will they and can they continue their studies, and also being away from families for people who weren't with the families. During the troublesome times, it was very difficult. And what I want to know now is, how did it impact this music performance students? So now we go on to the empirical part of my research, where I'll just tell you more about the methodology I followed. I questioned 25 classical music students from 3 different countries, from Norway, Serbia, and Slovenia. And the nature of this research was an empirical qualitative research. So I had interviews, they were in focus groups. So it was respondent, moderator. The researcher was the moderator, and they responded in groups, creating a conversation. And half of them were in person, half of them were online through Zoom. So they were interactive and hybrid in that way. And so 56 of them were enrolled in an undergraduate program, 44 were postgraduate, 12% of them were male, and 88% of them were female. And apart from being in the interviews, they also had to sign a consent form with a questionnaire where they agreed to complete anonymity. So throughout my work, you will not see any names, nor the names of the institutions they attend, or privacy reasons. So the research questions I asked the groups were the following 5. I had 5 main questions I wanted answered. And the first one was, were there any changes in the way students viewed performance before pursuing it academically? So how did they view performance when they were children to how they view it now? Most of the people spoke how when they were children, it was blissful, it was joyful, it was enjoyable for them, because they wanted to show to their parents, to their peers, to their teachers what they learned. They didn't fear that they'd be scrutinized by an audience. And growing up, when music became a bigger part of their identity, it's when music performance anxiety-related symptoms started showing in their life. And so that actually correlates perfectly with Anica Mićić's 2006 research, where she talks about it, meaning that there are similarities and it is still up to date. And afterwards they spoke about how people who were referred to as shy or reserved when children were more prone to actually have MPA later on. And lastly, people who weren't as prepared or just didn't practice enough also had a lot more stage fright when performing. So these are just the things we agreed upon as a group. You can read all of their quotes in the actual work. I will just give you a brief summary to the answers of all of those questions. And then the second one was, did the pandemic cause any disruptions in pre-established practice regimes, causing changes in motivational levels? This was an interesting one because there were a lot of polar opinions on this topic. Some of them said that it was fatal for them because they couldn't access their instruments. Especially, I had a harpist who was a participant who said that she didn't have the instrument of her own, and she lost touch with her musical self, she lost touch with music overall, she didn't want to perform anymore, and she lost a sense of self because she wasn't able to access her instrument. And then we have people who said that they had so much creative liberty now because they didn't have to stick to a rigorous schedule every single day, so they had so much time on their hands to reinvent their practice regimes and just experiment with their practice, and that was wonderful for them. And others talked how the lack of concerts essentially didn't give them the purpose to continue on. Which, and the third question is addressed, did the lack of social interaction in individual lessons, chamber music and orchestra cause side effects in the students' education path? Also a lot of polar opinions here, but the majority said yes, it did, while others said that orchestra took more than it gave during the times of their in-person studies, because it was a short period of time that they would practice long hours, or just 3 or 4 days, and their energy levels always would be extremely low during those times. So they said that they didn't miss it at all, which was interesting to me. And some people said that it was extremely difficult for them, especially singers practicing without a piano accompanist, and especially people starting out their first years of university without that support system. Then, later on, people addressed how they needed to feel seen and validated by other musicians, so they started listening to podcasts of other musicians, reading books or audiobooks, listening to audiobooks. And also they very much so enjoyed the Berlin Film Portal, as well as the Metropolitan Opera's one, where they had free subscriptions for everyone. So they felt like they were a part of something bigger, again, through the help of them. Then our second to last question is, were there any changes in music performance anxiety levels during and post-pandemic, and did the students' institution provide adequate support? And here I have some of the answers, so I don't say the wrong statistics. So 56% of the students reported an increase in NPA-related symptoms, while 20% of them said that they got better after COVID. And all of these information, that's the only quantitative aspect that I have to my research, and it was all calculated manually. So I just asked them a question, I gave them a hypothesis to answer to with yes, no, or neutral, or I just asked them a question and asked them to rate it on a 10-level Likert scale. And so you will see in the following bits. 16% of the people considered prescription medication to help them cope with their anxiety levels while performing, while 40% of participants thought of giving up classical music during COVID. And the stat that kind of surprised me the most was that 64% of them wanted to give up their career after the pandemic. And on a general scale, I asked them about the music performance levels they experienced pre-pandemic, and they rated it as a 5, and afterwards as a 6, meaning that there was an increase in music performance anxiety after the pandemic. And 84% of them agreed that their mother institutions did not provide enough resources during the time of troubles during the pandemic and after, on how to cope with music performance anxiety that was a byproduct of the pandemic. And now, this is the final bit of my presentation, the discussion, where I will just sum up some of the things. I will present you with the strengths and the weaknesses of my research and just conclude it all. And so the most surprising element to me was the amount of people who wanted to give up their profession. And one thing more, I forgot. There was a fifth question involved that I didn't answer. But were there any music-related skills that students would not have developed if it were not for the COVID-19 pandemic? And a lot of people said some very promising, bright things that just made me have some more hope in the youth. And they said things such as that they didn't believe that they could become so good at their own instrument, that they had so much free time, or they didn't know how independent they could be or how flexible they could be after all of it. Some singers said that their pianos have never been better because they were so scared of their neighbors hearing them practice. And so there was a lot of positive discourse, but most importantly, people just reported they were so much more self-confident in their ability to adapt to anything. So I would say that that's a strength of my research, that people kind of got to showcase the pros, the cons. They could showcase all the sides of their stories. I kind of wanted to go for a qualitative research to have their voices heard, and I think that's one of the most positive bits about my research. The thing that could be changed was that I would love if I started earlier, so I could have had a longitudinal research, meaning that I could have spoken with them while they were struggling during COVID, after COVID, and sometime after COVID. So I would have a broader look on that, but oh well. And lastly, I would have loved to have a what's the name? I would love to have, it's a cross-national research, a comparative one, where all 3 countries would have compared their results so I could see what were the differences in the countries. But there weren't a lot of candidates from Serbia and Slovenia, meaning there were only 3 people from Serbia and 3 from Slovenia and 19 from Norway, so it wasn't really possible to do a big comparison of it all. But the last thing I want to say is that as a student, as a young researcher, this is the least and the most I can do, and that is plainly just to bring awareness on the topic of mental health in students. And as long as we, as professionals, are making our efforts to lift the veil of shame when it comes to performance anxiety and just fear of performance, then I think we're on a good path. So thank you to people who have been a part of their research, for their time, for their efforts, for their stories, for their insight, and above all, thank you to Katarina Habe for all the support, for having faith and a lot of patience in me, and just believing in this idea. And thank you all for your time, for your attention, and if you have any questions, now's the time to do so. Thank you.